Hello and welcome to Uncommon Law, my podcast about true stories from my life experience of over 50 years as a lawyer and trial judge. This is a look at the law from the inside out, stuff they don't teach in law school. This is Judge Rudy, retired Justice of the New York State Supreme Court. I got a phone call from a relative of a relative on my wife's side, a distant relative, and it was about her. She introduced herself, and I knew her vaguely, and she said, calling about my brother Billy, and whether or not you would possibly represent Billy. I know what you've been through as a lawyer and everything else, and he needs a good lawyer, and I know you've got the character for it. It's a difficult task, so maybe you would consider it. Well, she was a lovely gal, and her brother was a real problem. Billy was currently serving 2 life sentences and a 15 to life for 3 homicides. He had killed a very high-end call girl in Manhattan. He killed the call girl's madam, and he killed the John, which was one of the customers of that call girl and the madam. And he ended up, he had 2 long trials, and he ended up being convicted in 3 homicides. The life sentences meant he couldn't be eligible for parole before 26 years. And the 15 to life was on top of that. So he was looking down the barrel of a very, very long prison sentence, which he had already served 3 years when I was being contacted. So I said, okay, and he was notorious, which I'll tell you why. Billy was a star witness at the Knapp Commission. The Knapp Commission back in those days, in the 70s, was a very high-profile New York City investigation into police corruption. I think Frank Serpico lit the match on the whole subject. But Billy became the star witness. He was a cop, and he was an undercover cop, what they called a plainclothesman in those days. Plainclothes cops were regular patrolmen. They were like junior detectives in a way. If a guy showed a little promise in uniform and he had a connection and he could get into plainclothes was a great detail because they handled pretty much vice work, which was drug dealers, prostitution, gambling, illegal sales of liquor or nightclubs, this, that, and the other thing. And the plainclothes squad was a very, very good detail. Most of the work was in Manhattan and involved the bars, the restaurants, and the hotels and nightclubs, et cetera, et cetera. And the plainclothes guys, they made a movie about it, and they were called Princes of the City because they went around. Their work took them to all of these places, and they ate and drank, met and caught at the highest class hookers you could find, and they never paid for anything. And they got used to it. And Billy got used to it. Billy not only got used to it, he got so used to drinking and eating and having the best women and never paying anything that he even created opportunities for freebies that didn't exist. And eventually he devolved into like a shakedown artist, you know. He just was he was a predator. And he was taking money and benefits anywhere he could find it. And he was flying high in Manhattan nightlife, which is about as good as it gets. As one reporter said years ago, a columnist, he called Manhattan, with all the delights that are available, Baghdad on the Hudson. And Billy was imbibing fully in all of this stuff. And he was going around without limits until there was a limit, and the limit was he crossed the line when he killed those 3 people. Now, to get out of that jam, as it were, he became a witness for the Knapp Commission. And he testified against the police department, the cops, the gamblers, the underworld. And the whole New York underworld works on a basic code, you know, that they all rely on each other to keep quiet. And Billy blew the code to smithereens. He ruined many, many, many lives. People called him, I did some research, and a lot of research, and they called him the devil incarnate. He was on the front page of the newspapers for months on end in New York and on TV. Cops went to jail. Cops lost their jobs and their pensions. Cops ruined their families. Cops committed suicide. The carnage was unlimited, and their families. I mean, Billy literally affected the lives, pejoratively, of hundreds of people. He ruined lives everywhere he went, and he never cared. And I wondered how he became an informant, and I came across, on another case, a federal prosecutor who claimed to have turned Billy into an informant. And this guy, like Billy, was an Irish American kid from New York City, a street guy just like Billy. Billy had come, his family had come from the Irish West Side, Hell's Kitchen in the 40s, in the 40th Street. They used to work on the docks with the passenger liners. And when they made some money, they migrated on the subway. They went to Times Square and got on the 7 train, and they moved to Sunnyside in Queens or Woodside in Queens, where Billy grew up. And they still had a hard scrabble life, but at least in Sunnyside and Woodside, they lived in 1 or 2 family houses or 3 family houses, and you could still see a tree or an occasional squirrel around the street, which was a big improvement on Hell's Kitchen. But he was a hard scrabble guy. Nobody gave them anything. They could hardly pay for anything that they needed. And he got used to, he got drunk on literally and figuratively on getting all these freebies. So he became a rogue cop. Now, a rogue cop in New York is like a man-eating tiger in India or a rogue elephant in Africa is going to do a lot of damage. And he did. He did, and it was indiscriminate. He didn't care. And the prosecutor that turned him told me how he did it. He did it very simply. He spoke to Billy. He said, Billy, let's understand something. All your life, whoever did anything for you, whoever protected you or helped you out. And Billy said, nobody. He says, that's right. And it's not going to change now. It's more true now than it ever was. Nobody's going to help you if you don't help yourself. You better look out for number one because nobody else is going to do it, Billy. So you better think about informing. If you're reluctant about it, that's your only shot. And Billy, bingo, caught on quick. And he was facing these murder charges, the 3 homicides. And he became an informant. And they made him promises about immunity, which we'll talk about a little bit later, which came into play. So he went out there and he testified with a vengeance. Again, ruining, and it was a slash and burn, like, Sherman's March to Atlanta. Everything in his sight was destroyed, and he didn't care. He was taking care of number one. When his sister called me, she said, how can we do anything about this? I said, well, he's up there. Where is he? She says, he's in Attica. I said, if you pay my way to Attica, I won't charge you any consultation. I know you've all, done. Just pay my round trip back and forth to Attica, and there won't be any consultation. I understand you've gone through a lot, and I'll be happy to try to help in that regard. She said, that's fine. She says, somebody's going to contact you. Billy has a girlfriend, and she's going to contact you, and she'll make the arrangements. You'll hear from her in the next week or so. I said, okay, thanks. I'll keep it in mind. Week or 10 days goes by, and I get a phone call from this young lady, and she says, hi, I'm Billy's friend, and his sister called you earlier about me. I said, yeah, I know. She said, well, I'd like to come and see you. Can I come and visit? I said, sure. We set up a time, and she told me her name, and she came to my office, and she had some notes with her. She said, Billy would like you to have this, and she says, I'm going to set all of this up. She said, but he'd like you to have this. And she was the loveliest, cleanest, prettiest, typical American girl you could find. It turns out she was born in upstate New York, and she was a flight attendant for a major airline. And in the days when they were very, very choosy about the looks and the persona of the young women they hired, it was a plum job. And I thought to myself, how does this nice, clean-cut kid from upstate, younger gal, she was about 29 years old at the time, fall for a rogue like Billy, who's definitely a bad guy? And, well, the truth made itself apparent a little bit later on. It turns out that she met Billy in Manhattan when Billy was one of the princes of the city, and he was a swashbuckling character. He's a good-looking guy, big personality, and he wasn't paying for anything, so she saw with him a wonderful good time, going around to the best clubs and restaurants, etc., etc. And she was dazzled by Billy. Plus, he had the personality and the looks to go with it. He was even flying his own plane. He had a private plane that he was flying. So literally and figuratively, he was flying high when she met him, and she was engrossed. And she stayed with him despite everything. And I found out later on, not only in this case, but in other cases, there are women that are attracted to convicts. And it's not uncommon. It's a pretty common proposition. Rogue convicts hook up with these good women. There's a couple of reasons. Some women they're attracted to bad boys. and they think they're going to reform them and straighten them out and this sort of thing, and sympathetic. But mostly it's because the relationships are very limited. They're very strict limits. Those guys are locked up, and it's very much like the relationship is very much like falling in love with a priest or a married man. You know, there are limits to the thing, in which the women accept, and they don't mind that. They don't want an everyday relationship with the humdrum stuff and the compromises and the good and the bad and the peaks and the valleys. It's a very, very convenient thing. On the other hand, the convicts have their self-respect and dignity, trammeled by the penal system, and they get a dose of feeling good by exploiting these women. And they're good con men, and they tell a sad story, and the women adopt it, and they can brag. They get bragging rights. Look at this, who I've got coming and bringing me stuff and taking care of me from outside. I got this good-looking gal or young, whatever. So it's a kind of a psychological win-win. It's weird, but it works. And they do that. And that's what happened here. Well, the young lady said, I'll come back. I'll send you tickets. I'll drop the tickets off. And what I'll do is I'll get you a flight to Buffalo. Because Attica is located upstate in western New York, between Buffalo and Rochester, kind of in a no man's land between the two cities. And she says, I'll pick you up at the Buffalo airport, and I'll drive you to Attica, and I'll wait there until you finish meeting Billy and do your business all day. And I'll drive you back to the airport. I said, all right, that's fine. That'll be. So I got the tickets. I then did, for the next 2 weeks, my own research about Billy. And I found out from everybody what a dastardly guy he really was. And the nicest thing I heard about Billy was dirty, rotten bastard who should rot in hell. And that was from the moderate people. That was from the good people and the modest people. It went down from there. I mean, it was nobody. It was unanimous. Nobody had anything good to say about Billy. The general tenor was he deserves everything that happened to him, whether or not these cases were legitimate, the homicides or otherwise. It doesn't matter. He should go to jail and go to hell and rot there for all that he's done and all the lives that he's ruined. And it went, it was just typical and unrelenting. It's all the same. Well, the big day comes, and I fly up to Buffalo, and it started weird. I got off the Buffalo airport, and there she was, Miss American Cheese there, white bread kid, nice, sweetie. And she picks me up, and we're driving. And I knew it was a weird day, because as soon as I got out of the Buffalo airport, we passed a roadside ranch, and I saw my first live buffalo just outside of Buffalo in a corral in a ranch in Buffalo. And we drove to Attica, and we kept the conversation light. We didn't get into anything. I said, look, I've done all the research. I don't have to talk about any of that stuff. And keeping the conversation superficial for a lawyer and a flight attendant is pretty easy. We had no problem doing that, and we did. And we killed some time, and we finally got to Attica. When I saw Attica, well, that's an imposing thing to see, if you've never seen it before. And you go there, and the thing that impresses you is the height and the starkness of the walls. It looks like the evil empire there. You got these giant walls, and all around the perimeter of this giant structure in the middle of nowhere is a lawn, probably about 200 feet, or maybe even 300 feet, 100 yards in width. And there are guard towers with machine guns and guys with rifles up there, snipers and everything else, and spotlights. And the whole thing is there because this gray monstrous structure. And there's nothing but grass, so that there's nothing to obstruct the aim of the guys on the tower if anybody dares to try to escape. Although I don't know how the hell they're escaping out of this place, with those walls and those gates. So she drops me off, and I get into the Attica. And the whole place is imposing, and it's just a heavy atmosphere. It's sort of like a monastery, but it's filled with killer monks. With all of these guys, it's a top security prison. It's one of the 3 top security prisons where the really worst criminals go in New York, and we have some doozies. The place is spotless. You can't find a speck of dirt in this place because nobody's got anything to do but to clean the place up all the time, and the floors are shining. Everything is spotless. The paint is fresh, and there's not a gun. When you get into the main section where the prison is a house, the guards don't have guns. They won't carry guns because they don't want guns to fall in the hands of the convicts. They only have batons. And the whole place is ruled, is a heavy, heavy atmosphere. The whole place is ruled with mutual respect and fear of everybody else is basically what's going on here, you know? And it's a real fear of consequences. And finally, I get through all the checkpoints, and there's a head count every 10 feet. I mean, you can't walk through Attica without 10 feet without breaking a rule somewhere or somehow. It's very, very strict. It's sort of like a sinister cloister operation there. Finally, I get to the attorney conference rooms, and it's not like the movies. Attorneys don't get visits like family. They're full contact visits. And you can sit in a room. Of course, there's two guards outside, and of course, there's a window on the door when they shut the door. And the whole thing, you got a little table and a couple of chairs. And the whole thing is to basically convey the idea of privacy. But everybody understands the thing is probably bugged and there are probably hidden cameras around, and you're not getting any real privacy. You got to be careful about what you say and how you talk. But in any event, here I am face to face with Billy. And Billy gets up and he makes quite an impression right away. First of all, he is handsome. He's a very personable guy. He's confident. And there's no bitterness or self-pity about him. He's a very upbeat guy. He's got a big smile on his face. The guy would have made a great politician or a salesman. This guy could do anything. And he's nothing what I imagined as a miserable coward who was an informant and a killer and all this other dastardly individual. He's actually thriving in jail. That day, later that day, he tells me he's going to stand up as the best man at another convict's wedding. And I don't know how he got to that point. I said, Billy, that's pretty good. How did you do that? He said, when I was first incarcerated, he said, I was in segregation because I was a cop and a snitch. He said, now, and I knew, in jail society, a cop is in danger because the cop probably arrested some of the people and got them imprisoned here that were behind walls with him. So being a cop in prison is a pariah. Also, being a snitch, that's one of the lowest things on the prison scales of social justice or standing. And Billy was a cop and a snitch. Maybe the thing that saved him was he only snitched on cops. But in any event, any convict who killed a cop behind the walls back there or killed a snitch would be revered by his colleagues. He would be a person who would be highly respected for doing what he did. And there was Billy thriving in this place with all of these guys, surrounded by all of these guys. I said, how did you manage this? He said, well, when I first arrested, I was in segregation. He says, which means I'm set off from the other prisoners. And he says, and it's almost like solitary confinement. The only people you see all day are a guard, and they may or may not want to talk to you depending on their attitude and disposition. He says, you go out for exercise by yourself, you're all alone, a little bit, maybe an hour or so, and all you're doing all day long is staring at the walls, and if you want to read a book or do push-ups or I don't know what else you can do to be, he says, it's a fate worse than death. After a certain while, it wears on you. He said, I'm dying here. He says, I'd much rather die. He says, I'm looking at 26 years minimum of this. He says, I can't do this. I'd rather die. He said, so I put in for a transfer, and they go through the motions of like giving me a hard time. Oh, no, we're worried about you. He said, but they didn't really care. They were happy to give me the transfer. Maybe I'll get killed in jail and I don't have to bother with me anymore. They didn't care. So after going through the motions, they did. I tell them I want to be in general population. My first day in the general population was the scariest day of my life. He says, I've never been scared in my life. I was frightened. He said, to the toes of my feet, he says, I was frightened. He says, on the first day, when it came time to go out into the exercise, yard with all the other prisoners, he said, and by the way, they all knew I was there because it's a big gossip factory. The whole place is like a beehive. Everybody knows everything, and the gossip goes flying around the place. They got nothing else to do. He says, so I walked out into the middle of the yard, and I stood my ground and planted my feet, and I put on my best, fuck you, I'm here. If anybody wants any business with me, here I am. He says, the whole place was stunned. He says, I guess, it was a surprising move, and it was a bold move. I said, well, it sure was. He says, he says, look, if I get killed, I get killed. He says, it's better than going back to segregation for the next 23 years. He said, so He said, and that worked. He says, I got, the grudging respect. I don't know what did it, but it worked. He says, and guys laid off me and laid back. And then the rest of it was Billy's personality eventually took over, and he was a very affable guy. He was a real con man, and he had a great personality. And they respected the fact that he did stand up in the middle of that yard. So now we get down to business. He said, and Billy, just like any convict with a brain, becomes his own lawyer. He's facing a long time. What else has he got to do? He goes to the law library. Now, the guys who become jailhouse lawyers are a funny lot. Some of them are very good, and they can be very good because the guy, when he's doing his own case, he knows details that other people don't know. He knows every detail infinitely of everything that happened. On the other hand, they look at things through a self-pity lens, and I've been jobbed. Oh boy, they screwed me and everything else, and it's sort of like rose-colored glasses, and they look at things in a different light that are not necessarily objective. But Billy wasn't like that. He handed me, he says, here, I've got 12 points. I've gone over my record. He says, I spent $80,000 on lawyers. Well, he didn't spend it. His family spent it. He saddled them with that bill back in the 70s. I had 3 lawyers. He said, I had F. Lee Bailey, the famous trial lawyer, and another guy, a New York lawyer, to back him up, which we had to have. He says, and then I had the appeals lawyer. On the first trial, Bailey tried the case, and we had 10 jurors for acquittal and 2 jurors who wouldn't go along. He said, the 10 were men. He said, the 2 who wouldn't set me free, or acquit me, were women, and we believe it was because of my lifestyle. He said, they're I'm whoring around. He said, and they see that, my wife was married, but I wasn't. He said, and they held that against me, and I understand that, and that's what did me in with them. He said they hated the idea that I was, that I did what I did. I basically betrayed my wife and my family and everything else. He said, so the second trial comes around, and Bailey's not available because he himself is on trial in Florida for alleged jury tampering. And so the guy who was his second, the New York lawyer, who was a well-known lawyer, he said the guy was incompetent. I didn't know that. When he took over the case in the second trial, he says he was incompetent. He says, and my appeals lawyer, who did the appeal, he said, that guy's nothing but a drunk. Now, I knew, because I had done research on both of those lawyers, and I didn't say anything to Billy, but he was right, because my research was impartial, and I checked him out with other lawyers, and they were absolutely right. One guy had seen the second trial and said, that guy doesn't know what he's doing, and he's got a big name in our profession. Some guys promote themselves, but it doesn't necessarily mean they're really good lawyers when push comes to shove. And as for the appeals lawyer, he was a big name, and he was a drunk. Now, whether or not that affected his appeal, I don't know, but he was a drunk, and Billy had that right. The problem was Billy's record of all the proceedings and everything else was 12,000 pages, and it was a big, big project. So Billy said, I have these 12 points. What do you think? Look them over. So I looked them over. I said, Billy, 2 of them are good. The other 10 you could do away with. What do you mean? I said, you're just going to dilute the case with all of this other minor stuff. I said, you don't want to distract the judges. You want them to concentrate on what you have. That's really, really good. And you don't want to belittle that, by confusing it with all of this other nonsense. That doesn't really, it's okay, but it doesn't really matter. He said, well, which 2? And I said, well, you have 2 real good issues here. One's much better than the other, but the other one's a viable issue. I said, the first issue is a juror in the second trial withheld the fact during jury selection that he was a job applicant at the DA's office in Manhattan where the case was being tried and who was prosecuting the case. I said, and the prosecutors probably knew it, and they held it back. I said, that's a real issue. That's a real issue. And that's a possible winner. I said, the other one was the promise of immunity that they gave you at the Knapp Commission, but I don't know how that's going to travel because the immunity from what you testified to, you weren't prosecuted for that stuff. You were prosecuted for the murders, and you think the murders are included in that, and they'll argue that they never said anything about the murders, and that's a separate deal. I said, but that's at least a viable argument. It could go either way. He says, well, okay, that's good. He said, if you think that those are good issues. I said, yeah. He said, well, what about taking my case And now he starts the con job, and he starts to schmooze me. I know how you became a lawyer. You flunked out of law school and you went and you little clerked. And I know that you're tough and you come from the street and you're not going to take anything from the establishment and you're not afraid of anybody. You're sure of yourself, etc., etc. I said, yeah, Billy. And it sounded great. But, like all con men, he went too far. How would you like to be the next F. Lee Bailey? I said, oh, really? He said, yeah. He said, do you know what made Bailey famous? I said, yes, I do. I said, there was a case in Cleveland, Dr. Sam Shepard, and who was accused of murdering his wife and children. He said, well, he says, Bailey reversed that, got that reversed, and that's what made him nationally. He said, now, if you reverse the case, that I had with Bailey, he said, you can be a nationally known and famous lawyer. I said, yeah, Billy, but there's only one problem here. I said, now it's my turn, because I'm listening to Billy, and he's giving me the con job. The problem is your case and Shepard's case are different. In Cleveland, half the population thought Shepard was innocent, and the other half thought just as strongly that he was guilty. In your case, dirty, rotten bastard was the best I could come up with. I said, now, judges, nobody thinks you're innocent, Billy. Nobody. There's no goodwill or sympathy, not an ounce. I couldn't find it anywhere outside of your sister, and that was just pity. That's it. I said, and loyalty, and your girlfriend, maybe. I said, that's it. Nobody else. And judges put their pants on one leg at a time, just like everybody else. They read between the lines. And your case is going to have no sympathetic quality about it. There's going to be a total absence of goodwill. So it's a real tough road. I said, well, will you take my case? You don't give a crap about that. I said, well, yeah, I do, Billy, but here's the story. There's only 3 reasons to take a case. One is big money. You don't have big money. If I were to charge you for I'll give you a fee. I have to marry this case. I'm already married. I have a wife, and I have a married at work. I have a law partner. But a 12,000-page record, I'm going to have to marry this case for a year. That's all I'm going to have to do. So for you, I quoted him a number. It was not unreasonable, but it was high, but it wasn't unreasonable under the circumstances. I said, now, you don't have that kind of money, and if you have that kind of money, you call me up, and we'll think about it. I said, the second thing is publicity. I says, it's going to be bad. There's going to be a lot of publicity, but it's going to be bad. Now, Jimmy Breslin, I said, he always says there's no such thing as bad publicity. I said, well, I don't always agree. I'm going to be vilified here, but I can handle that. I said, but it's not going to be good publicity, Billy, so that's not an inviting thing. So you don't have the money, the publicity's bad. That's 2 strikes. The other thing is legal merit. Well, you have some merit to your case, but I don't think that's going to win the day because these judges are not going to be sympathetic to you. I said, so really, I'm not too happy about this. And he said, well, and he tried to give me some more con job about how good I was, how tough, and I would really like you to think this over, and maybe you could take the case. I said, well, I will. And I shook his hand, and I left. Went back, and true to form, Billy ended up representing himself. And he followed my advice, and he got a habeas corpus petition in the Southern District of New York, the federal court. I think the judge was Judge Sweet, who granted the petition and ordered Billy freed immediately. The prosecutors from Manhattan DA's office ran right upstairs in the same building to a higher floor to the appeals court, the Second Circuit Court of Appeals, which had jurisdiction, and got that reversed immediately as far as the release. Okay, and they reversed the judge in the lower court. As again, no surprise, there was no sympathy for Billy. Now Billy was in a position of needing permission of the Supreme Court, the United States, to hear his case because he had no wins here, and he had to get a writ, what they call a writ of certiorari, and who handled it was the Chief Judge, Warren Burger, the Chief Justice of the United States Supreme Court. And Warren Burger, I read in the papers, Warren Burger said the Supreme Court welcomes the opportunity to address the issues in Billy's case. And I said, uh-oh, that's not good. Because Warren Burger, for 2 or 3 years before that, was publicly decrying the fact that the Supreme Court of the United States was filled with spurious criminal appeals of no merit. And he was trying to find a way to get rid of them and get them out of that court and cluttering up the calendar so that they could deal with serious stuff. And here he was welcoming a case. Well, if he's welcoming a case, it's just because he's going to use this as a vehicle to disqualify a class of criminal appeals that he didn't want to handle. And I knew that was coming. But Billy didn't see it that way, of course. I got a Christmas card from Billy. Oh, I'm going, and he got certiorari. And it takes about a year. And who comes up on his case now? William Kunstler becomes of counsel to Billy, not his attorney of record. Of counsel means he's only there as an advisor, not as the attorney of record. So now he gets publicity from being on Billy's case, which is all he cares about, and no responsibility for representing Billy before the Supreme Court of the United States. And Kunstler he's a terrific trial lawyer, and he's a really good lawyer, but he had a bad reputation in the legal profession. His reputation was a guy who was there for the spotlight, and as soon as the spotlight goes away, he goes away. He's not a stand-up guy. He claims to make no money from representing these radical people, and meanwhile, his family is well off, and his law practice is doing very well from his name recognition, and he gets all kinds of cases from the publicity that he generates. And he had a bad reputation in Attica. The warden of Attica wrote a book and said during the riots, the rioters asked to speak to a number of people from the outside. And who goes there to speak to them at their request was William Kunstler and Bobby Seale, the head of the Black Panthers. And when they went there, according to the warden, they told the prisoners, keep the revolution going, don't worry about it, fight the good fight, off the pigs, all of this kind of revolutionary nonsense. But they walk out. They go out, they go have dinner, and then they're out of, they didn't stay for the fight. They were encouraging these people to fight, knowing that Governor Rockefeller had the place surrounded, and if push comes to shove, he was going to start executing these guys. It's like shooting fish in a barrel. On the other hand, Herman Badillo was a New York City controller, Puerto Rican guy, wonderful man, and Arthur Eve, a black assemblyman from Buffalo. They were also requested, and they went in and told these guys, you made 22 demands, you got 19, it's on national television, everybody knows about it. You made as much progress in these 3 days than you ever made in the last 20 years. Stop, because it's only doomsday you're looking at. And that wasn't popular, but they told him the right thing. Kunstler and Bobby Seale pandered. These other guys didn't. So there was a contrast. Well, anyway, Kunstler had his case, notwithstanding his of-counsel standing or anything else. Case was decided, and guess what? Billy lost. And there was no sympathy. Billy stayed in prison for 46 years. He was released. After 46 years in prison, he was in his 80s, late 80s, close to 90 years old, and he finally got out, and a few years later, he died. And, well, Billy's gone, but he's not forgotten. I'll never forget Billy, nor will I ever forget what he told me just before I left the prison at our meeting. And he said, Rudy, I'm hoping you take my case. I want to get out of here. He said, I want to get out of here bad. He said, do you know what the worst thing about being in prison is? I said, no, Billy, I can imagine. He says, I don't know if you can imagine. He says, let me tell you. He says, I can't go out to a movie, have pizza with my girlfriend, sleep over, get up in the morning and get on with the rest of my life. He says, all the obvious stuff. That's obvious, he says, and you miss that, but it's not the worst thing in the world. He says, the worst thing about being in prison, he says, is that you are surrounded by people here who would kill you. He said, for cutting the line to get lunch, or they would kill you for the thought of you got the mashed potatoes and the mashed potatoes ran out and they didn't get mashed potatoes, and they would lay in the hallway a week later and stick a jagged glass shiv in your liver for the fact that you beat them to the last mashed potatoes. He said, in this prison, you are at the mercy of the lowest common denominator of people that surround you. And look around, the denominator is pretty low. Of course, he was excluding himself in that calculation, I thought. But that was something I'll never forget. I look back and I could say, I met the devil. And I found out that the devil was just like the rest of us. He had his pluses and minuses, and he was a human being. He was pretty much just like every one of us. Not much different. And that was a real eye-opener for me. Thanks for listening. Come back next week for another episode of Uncommon Law, lessons they don't teach in law school. I'm Judge Rudy Greco. Court is adjourned.